Okay, week two. Today or this week, we're looking at race in America, which obviously is a real big subject and broad, and there's not a lot of time to get into all the ins and outs. Um, you will be reading the narrative Frederick Douglass for your book report, and then you have your regular reading in 500 Years, all of which have something to do with race and the creation of race in this country. You probably know it's something that we're still trying to deal with in this country. A lot of people say, with the Civil War, the North won the war, the South won the narrative. And that's very true in many ways. And what that really gets at is, instead of dealing with what the war was actually about after the Civil War, the country basically went back to a system of enslavement of blacks in the South instead of actual slavery. It was sharecropping was the system that was in place that basically recreated the slave system, and there was also forced prison labor all over the South at the expense of prisoners working for the government. So, in other words, instead of fixing the problems after the Civil War, the country went on to just recreate the problems, and then the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was supposed to solve all that as well. But again, we have what's known today as the new Jim Crow. So, anyways, we don't have, there's no way to work all these issues out, but I want you to be keeping some things in mind as you work through the material for this week, having to do with race. So first of all, race is a modern idea. We basically invented the notion of race in this country, in the Americas, not just the United States of America, but across the Americas. Europeans needed the concept of race basically to justify the way they treated Native Americans and African Americans, for the most part, but Africans, and later Asians, for that matter. So this notion of white superiority was developed here in the Americas basically as a way to justify treatment of other peoples. There's no such thing as genetic race. This is something else people don't understand, because we see dark skin, light skin, dark eyes. We see all these physical traits, so we assume it must be genetically based, but that's really not true. There's actually not that much genetic diversity within humans in general. And again, if you get into the genetics of it, you see there's more variation within a race than across races. So there's no biological basis for race, even though we see it. It's sort of a false narrative. If you start looking at genetics, we're all so closely related back just a few generations. Slavery has been with human beings forever. Race has not. Like I said, race is a relatively new concept. Slavery has, as far as we can tell, always existed in some form in civilizations, and don't think it doesn't exist today. It's still around in many different ways, here in this country and around the world. Not legally, of course. So slavery is illegal, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, just like anything else against the law. Throughout history, societies have enslaved others, often as a result of conquest or war, but not because of physical characteristics or a belief in natural inferiority. In America, a unique set of circumstances led to the enslavement of people who looked similar. And that's why, so race becomes a way to basically justify slavery in this country. And this is where the irony of America creeps in here, right? Because race and freedom were born together. When the United States was founded, equality was a radical new idea. But our early economy was based largely on slavery. The concept of race helped explain why some people could be denied rights and freedoms that others took for granted. Of course, the same thing applied to women, right? Women were not given any political rights at the founding of this country. At the time, actually, the law basically recognized women only as extensions of their husband. So basically, the woman's entire identity was covered by her husband. We call that the law of coverture. And so her husband's vote was actually her vote. And women, we don't even move away from the law of coverture until the mid-19th century, when women finally actually begin to get the right to own property and other things. So keep that in mind as well, that these notions of superiority apply to white males as well. So throwing gender into the mix, or sex, I should say, into the mix of race. Race justifies all these social inequalities, like I said. So if you believe there's a biological thing called race, you can believe that maybe one race is superior to another. So race as an idea justified extermination of Native Americans, exclusion of Asian immigrants, and taking of Mexican lands. Racial practices were institutionalized within government, laws, and society, as I've been saying. There is no such thing as race, or here you'd consider it a subspecies. Unlike many animals, modern humans have not been around long enough, nor have populations been isolated enough to evolve into separate subspecies or races. Despite surface differences, we are among the most similar of all species. And the genetics completely bears this out. There's lots of good new research on the genetics and how we're all connected. And if you want to get into it, there's a really good book, very recent. It's called A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived. And it basically checks the genetic links between peoples around the world. And we're all descended from the same woman who lived about 100,000 years ago in Africa, and the same man who lived around the same time someplace else in Africa, known as mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam, they call him. And it has a lot to do with genetics. But, in other words, you go back about 100,000 years, which is not a long time at all, and you can isolate one person from whom we are all descended. So that just shows how closely related we all are. Skin color is only skin deep. Most traits are inherited independently of one another. The genes for skin color have nothing to do with genes for texture, eye shape, hair texture, eye shape, blood type, musical talent, athletic ability. And most variation actually occurs between the races. Of the small amount of total human genetic variation, 85% exists within any local population, be they Italians, Kurds, Koreans, or Cherokees. 2 random Koreans are likely to be as genetically different as a Korean and an Italian. And again, not just because we don't have that much variation to begin with as human beings. We spread out around the world very rapidly, beginning about 100,000 years ago. And all of the variations we see are just basically locally derived traits like hair color, skin color, things like that don't have any bearing on our overall genetic structure or any great variation from our overall genetic structure. And just so you know, when we say race isn't biological, we're not saying race doesn't exist and racism doesn't exist. It's still a very powerful idea. It's a powerful social idea that gives people different access to opportunities and resources. Our government and society have created advantages to being white. This affects everyone, whether we are aware of it or not. And that's very true. Institutionalized racism is just a matter of fact in this country. Colorblindness will not end racism. Pretending race doesn't exist is not the same as creating equality. Race is more than stereotypes and individual prejudice. To combat racism, we need to identify and remedy social policies that advantage some groups at the expense of others. So that's the bottom line for today's stuff. It's not just about what happened in the past and you're reading these sources. I want you to draw, when I ask you to draw a line to the present day, I'm saying how is our current situation with race and identity and how it affects people today and how it is in our institutions, how it isn't in our institutions. So when I say draw a line from the sources to today, that's what I'm asking you to do, is analyze what we have today connected to what you're going to be reading about. Some of the sources go back to the very first codification of black codes in Virginia. So enjoy, and feel free to contact me with any questions.